Hello, my name is Grzymala-Busse. I am the director of the Europe Center here at Stanford University. And I'm delighted today to welcome Tatjana Thelen, who is a professor of social and cultural anthropology at the University of Vienna. She's a member of the steering committee of the Vienna Doctoral School of Social Sciences and the deputy head of the research platform for the study of transformations of Eastern Europe. Her research focuses on care and on the state, and the ways in which family, kinship, and the responsibilities of the state interact. Today, Professor Thelen will speak on how West Germans cared for their kin in East Germany, and a talk entitled Parcels for These, politically important, theoretically overseen. Welcome, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and the kind introduction. I would start with a few words on the general framework in which I developed the thoughts I'm going to present here. In 2016-17, myth historians from UCLA and the University of Zurich, I co-led an interdisciplinary research group to rethink the epistemological split between politics and kinship, as well as its consequences. And so we had a number of fellows, events, and resulting publications. And the one on the slide, which I brought actually here, because I just got it a couple of weeks ago, and it's always so nice to have the material object there, is this edited volume. And in the introduction to this book, we argue that as part of 19th century imaginary, social scientists developed the thesis that political order in so-called primitive or pre-modern societies was based on kinship. This is an extremely influential idea and was contrasted then with modern states in which the two domains were rightly kept separate. Now, in our view, this is not the whole story. Kinship has neither completely disappeared from the political order and cultures of the West, nor played it the deterministic role in what has been attributed elsewhere. Moreover, the idea is normative. It not only was part of the colonial domination, but it continues to influence the analysis in ways that perpetuate hierarchies with far-reaching epistemological and practical implications. So thus, the separation has become a conceptual issue that we cannot simplistically dismiss, for example, with terms like corruption, which would be the illegitimate incursion of family interests into government, or kinship in the wrong place. So for us, this suggests that it's high time to reconceptualize the link between kinship and political order. So this is basically the framework of the book, and this general framework has given me the chance to revisit some of my earlier findings about kinship across the former German border. Today, what I'm presenting is less fresh empirical data, rather than asking why these practices do not show up in the literature. And to answer this question, I analyze what is normatively at stake in the critiques to my work, and what it does reveal about the epistemological consequences. My argument will proceed in 3 steps. I will start with some historical background on former practice of sending parcels from West Germany to the socialist East. And their importance begs the question of why they have no place in theory. I continue then by summarizing my earlier findings on the dissolution of these ties after unification, and then turn to the underlying assumptions in my lay and scholarly critiques. Searching for the basis in various bodies of literature, I finally argue that we can only understand the epistemological void around these relations against the backdrop of ideas about modernity and the role of kinship in it. Okay, I come to the background. In West German political self-understanding during the decades when the two German states existed, the term partition played a central role. It made it possible to hold the socialist other responsible for an artificial partition rather than seeing it as the consequence of the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany. The term implies a pre-existing whole that was hard to define and thus required a symbol of unity. Appealing to ethnicity, not to mention race, was of course out of question. In this situation, kinship as a kind of natural expression of belonging seemed to be quite a convenient and apparently apolitical basis for strengthening the idea of Germany as a unit after the building of the Berlin Wall, basically. Kinship terminology in political discourse was extended to the territory of the GDR as phrases like our brothers and sisters in the East. However, support did not evolve spontaneously or not in the degree spontaneously than it was expected and hoped for. And in this situation, the West German state during the following decades organized repeatedly campaigns calling its citizens to send letters and parcels across the border. In addition, the state subsidized the parcels by allowing the senders to deduct the cost from their taxable income. The political aim of promoting unity was quite explicit, as stated, for example, in this ministerial memorandum. The main idea of this support is, besides material help, a political goal. The parcel as an expression of solidarity should enforce human contact and strengthen the responsibility of the citizens of the FRG for the conservation of the feeling of belonging together. So I translated this literally. It sounds a little bit awkward, this kind of bureaucratic German and English, I know, but I think you get the point. Oh, I have to look that up. in the books. Yeah, it makes a difference. I agree. So anyhow, there were received repeated campaigns that expressed a sense of moral obligation and emphasized Easterners' need and desire for the parcels, and they changed also in character. I'm not going into too much detail, but I have here some examples. So this, for example, is a postage stamp, and these others were posters. So the postage stamp claims your parcel to the other side, which is drüben, they are waiting for it. And one of the posters asks, I'm not sure if that is on the screen, have you done your share? Another reads, don't leave them alone. So some of them recommended sending staple foods and secondhand clothing, constantly evoking the sense of an urgent material need in the GDR. In addition, the so-called Ministry for All German Affairs, this also changed names, launched writing and drawing competitions in schools on topics like what use is your parcel to the zone? The people in the zone need us, and zone here alludes to the Soviet occupation zone, which already at the time was kind of anachronistic, but it stayed in use for a long time because the GDR was not acknowledged. So the campaigns were seemingly quite successful. While there exists no statistics, no exact statistic, it is estimated that in the 60s, around 45 million parcels were sent annually from the west to the east, and this then slowly went down to around still 25 million in the 1980s. The charitable character of West German parcel campaigns did not, of course, go unnoticed by the government in the east, which firmly rejected it. As part of their general policy of restricting cross-border contact, they ruled that parcels had to be declared as personal gifts. Despite these regulations, the contents of the Westpakete were mostly standardized. And I have here an example where I do have the date on the slide from 62, kind of the usual, the typical content. Such parcels could be ordered in shops where the employees would also assemble and even mail them. Moreover, the parcels were increasingly directed not to individuals, but sent to and received by wider circles of relatives. Their contents were distributed and letters read aloud at family gatherings. As symbols of Western capitalism, specific brands were often preferred. Many people in Eastern Germany still remember, and we just talked about this before the talk here, that still remember from their childhood the smell of the Westpakete and how it symbolized this wished-for world of capitalism. In contrast, the Eastern goods smelled like unwanted socialism. However, what were considered luxuries in the GDR, like for example, coffee, which is also here on the slide, had often already become staples in the West. This inequality reinforced the charitable character of West to East transfer and prepared the ground for later dissolution of extended kinship when the border vanished. Even though the Westpakete was supposed to signify political unity, they were also imbued with constructions of East-West difference and hierarchy. When the wall fell, they became politically unimportant, and despite, for example, persistent inequality between the Western and Eastern parts of Germany, no more state campaigns were launched for individual support between relatives. Instead, an impersonal and universal solidarity tax was introduced. And for the first time, or since a long time at least, the citizenship laws were changed, so which basically softened the jus sanguinis, so the aspect of blood relations as a condition of belonging. At the same time, the Westpaket became a symbol and vehicle for political critical commentary by and a symbol of political subjectivity of Easterners, a critique that usually provokes protest by West German academics and other intellectuals. And here I come then to the dissolution of these ties. So after unification, the public discourse about East and West quickly shifted to emphasize differences rather than similarity. This fed into new political identifications that persist even today and in which kinship relations are not unimportant. In any case, my East German interlocutors' accounts of their relations with West German kin often ended with the dissolution of ties. These narratives depicted West German relatives as arrogant, and in hindsight, the parcels received had come to demonstrate this attitude. So when with unification, the access to and knowledge about consumer goods had spread quickly. Thus, people soon noticed that the once highly valued goods had often been rather cheap staples from large supermarket chains. And this is how one of my interlocutors put it, Aldi coffee and mass-produced t-shirts. Moreover, Easterners suspected that their relatives had left them to believe, so consciously had made them to believe that the gifts had needed much more effort or sacrifice than they actually had. Like the perception of goods, the interpretation of relationships changed. The second important aspect of these stories is the stress on overestimating of need during socialist times. Due to the humanitarian tone of the campaigns, it was easy for West Germans to overestimate the material wants of the GDR. One of my interlocutors recounted with outrage how he had been sent a used pair of shoes in the 1980s, and also commented on how his wife's cousin sent used clothing as if they had been in Africa. So I'm not going into the racist stereotyping here, but very clearly by othering Africans who are supposedly in real need, he expressed offense at how he was treated as an aid recipient. Likewise, many of my other Eastern German interlocutors recounted receiving unwanted and unnecessary goods. In retrospect, at least, the received care was devalued and interpreted as indicating Western arrogance. Interestingly enough, these narratives about both earlier support and the later estrangement were recounted as personal issues unlinked to politics. In public and academic discussion, the same stories were similarly either interpreted as personal, albeit with different view on the equality, or as outcome of economic frameworks. And now I turn to my critical commentators. I first presented these Eastern European narratives at a workshop in 2005, so this is almost like 20 years ago, and received some indignant and even hostile reactions to my presentation. In particular, a West German woman in the audience contested my account by recalling how much effort and money they had put into the packages and the gratitude they had elicited. Ever since that first presentation, my findings have evoked similar critical responses. Usually, it's well-educated West Germans emphasizing the emotional quality of the relations. This could be either through accounts of lasting relationships, so not breaking up, or by presenting, as in this first example, Easterners as having been appropriately satisfied by what the Westerners had to give. When trying to refute the imbalance I described, better off Western Germans sometimes stressed their joy when receiving goods from the East as well. Usually they would mention having received classical music, recordings, or books. Nevertheless, this also implies that nothing else was available in the GDR, either because of political censorship or scarcity of desirable and high quality products. The stress placed on emotional closeness and unity causes the politics implicit in the making of these ties to fade out of sight. Although these reactions aimed to contest my interpretation, they ended up supporting it, or rather supporting my Eastern German interlocutors' narratives of Western paternalism. Actual expression of kin relations surely varied, but it seemed important for my West German audience that their voice remains authoritative in defining the nature of German kinship. Relations have been and are an expression of closeness, and Eastern Germans are grateful. However, it is not my intention to support or argue against any interpretation, but to trace why it was and is so important for my audience that I get things right. The importance, I argue, belies the reporting as purely personal matters and hints at the politics of making cross-border kinship something that has not received enough attention in the social sciences. And before I turn to this, I need to have a look at a second, albeit related kind of critique. Although the paternalist attitude of Western Germans hints at equality, they stress actually sameness and belonging, so unity. A different critique comes from mostly international colleagues. For example, at my very last presentation within this group in the year 2017, a colleague asked about the differences in kinship practices on each side, and another scholar similarly wondered if kinship meant something else in the East. Both argued that in a situation of shortage, after all, people would use whatever relations available, including kin, to secure scarce goods. In contrast to the West German claims of emotional closeness and equality, despite differential access to resources, international colleagues were thus looking for difference. Speculating about divergent practices and interests evokes the supposedly different nature of socialist kinship. In this functionalist interpretation, socialist citizens developed a more strategic investment in kin than their capitalist counterparts. Due to the socialist economy failing to provide various goods, Easterners supposedly sought to expand their network, including extended kin. Instead of emotional closeness, economic inequality became the driving force between essentially different ways of living relatedness. While Germans on both sides leave out any link to the politics involved in the making of kin across the border, instead presenting individual experiences, the second critique excludes politics in favor of economics. At least for anthropology, this represents unusual, and I'm an anthropologist, this represents an unusual diversion towards theoretical functionalism and economic determinism. Once again, I'm not concerned with empirically verifying or the narratives of my interlocutors, but the ideas behind both of these critiques. Why does belonging together appear to be taken for granted on the West German side as something that cannot or should not be questioned by accounts of hierarchy and conflict? What kinds of assumptions about the sameness and otherness do the critical utterances imply? Why are the politics of kinship not mentioned? And most importantly, how could specific interpretations become pervasive? And to approach these questions, I turn to two distinct bodies of literature. On the one hand, what is written about family and kinship, and on the other hand, the body of scholarship on post-socialism. First of all, the few works on family life in the socialist GDR never mentioned extended kinship anywhere, let alone across the border. No representative studies of family lives exist that follow comparable standards to those in the West. The only extended, there's one extended study on the everyday life of families in the GDR, paid tribute to Engels' evolutionary model before presenting its own results on what it called complete families, that is, heterosexual conjugal families based on emotional closeness. Its authors even felt the need to defend the existence of three-generation households at length. The political sensitive topic of kin relations with West Germans was not mentioned at all. An obvious explanation for this void would be the generally weak position of the social sciences in an authoritarian socialist state. But how then was the topic dealt with in Western social sciences with its supposedly greater freedom and importance? As it turns out, not very differently. So I looked through several of the best well-known and used introductory texts to family sociology, and I have not found a single mention of extended kinship on each side or across the former border. In general, family sociologists have long been preoccupied by the alleged reduced size of and shift to conjugal families due to modernization. The text usually describe the modern family as characterized by individual choice of marriage partners, a loss of economic functions, and a simultaneous increase of the importance of emotional ties, what is also called emotionalization of the family. Even if sociological textbooks refer briefly to critiques by historians of the idea of a core family as a modern phenomenon, practices across the German border are not considered. The few specific treatments of either kinship or extended families, so when the words actually show up in the textbooks, they tend to be brief summaries of mostly outdated anthropological kinship theories and terminologies. So this more or less explicit evolutionary and or cultural ecological undertone is not very different from socialist sociology. Now, anthropology usually has a greater awareness of kinship, but in regards to Germany, the situation looks surprisingly similar. The only explicit study of letters sent across the border frames them in terms of forming exchange communities and not in terms of kinship. Even the most comprehensive ethnographic account of kinship in the two Germanys by John Bornemann emphasizes, so he goes through this history, diverse normative and legal differences between the two countries, but extended kin or cross-border relations remain unnoticed. Meanwhile, we have also comparative quantitative scholarship that has analyzed different patterns of birth and marriage rates, as well as the so-called pluralization of family forms in both states. So usually the debates among authors on their findings have asked which pattern points to more or less achieved modernization. Thus, they would discuss whether the comparatively young age of first marriages and birth in the GDR indicates delay in modernization, or if, on the contrary, the higher number of births outside wedlock and higher rates of female labor market participation would be seen as an advantage or an advance in temporal terms. I found two, I think, post-unification collections give a rather anecdotal account of the experience of Easterners receivers of the so-called Westpakete, and there you find this quotations like the smell is still there and so forth. I have not come across any scholarly depiction of experience on the West German side. It seems, unimportant. In sum, none of these different approaches mentions, let alone theorizes, the practice of extended kin within each German state or across the border. Cross-border kin relations and the many activities each side undertook when they were buying or making, packing and distributing The items and information given and received have never made it into social scientific analysis. On both sides of the border, social scientists followed evolutionary and modernization theory and saw the conjugal family as the only meaningful unit of kinship. The temporal narrative of kinship decline in the self-ascription of a modern society as consisting of small apolitical family units, I argue, blinds us to the phenomenon. According to this hegemonic view, only others, so those who supposedly have not yet reached modernity, would still place high importance on extended kinship. And even those anthropologists and a few sociologists who criticize the narrative as too simplistic and acknowledge the coexistence of several family types in modern societies have either migrant or minority groups in mind. Likewise, the extensive literature on transnational kinship networks of migrants from the global south to richer countries in the global north often portray remittances and parcels sent as practices, the practices for support of the left behind kin as an expression of pre-existing traditional families. In this view, these practices do not represent a modern tradition or something new. Instead, being born in a non-Western country seems to translate into having kinship. These relations then translate seemingly easily into following norms of support even after international migration. Now, in contrast, the extended German kinship, there are no recognized differences of ethnic groups involved, rather representing this kind of mobile traditional obligation in a transnational context. Kinship here seems to transcend the border and attest to the indivisibility of the political unit. Being bound to the modernization narrative, the normative sameness and equality of this account does not seem to have lent itself to an analysis of kinship practices across the border. If the existence of extended kin is noted, like in my findings, it will be interpreted as a kind of leftover of socialist abnormality. In this version with unification, East Germany is then, seemingly having returned now to modern normality. Thus, again, the former border practices fade out of sight. In the scholarly variant of this account, socialist kinship, very much like transnational or minority kinship, is often understood in the functionalist manner as oriented toward fulfilling deficiencies in access to goods and services. Instead of sameness, this perspective finds difference through the ambivalent construction of the socialist other. And here, then, I would turn to the scholarship on socialism. In the literature of post-socialism, modernization theory had made a surprising reappearance in the 1990s. Socialist societies were often seen as a halted modernization due to too much state presence in economic and private life. If this framework would be changed, everything would turn back to normal, that is the Western part of modernization. In this perspective, the socialist state and its institution were seen through the contrastive lens of difference, while its citizens were seen to be the same, that is essentially similar to other Europeans. They acted in the same rational way, the attitudes were similar, but they were condemned to live in this inefficient and sometimes irrational socialist institutional framework. One author who has become especially important in analyzing the deficiency of state socialism is Hungarian-born economist János Kornai. He represented socialism as an economy of shortage. The inherent shortages resulted from improper property relations and allocation of resources. This theory is based on a neo-institutional framework and its assumptions about rational decision-making and a general scarcity of resources. There's more to say to this, but I have to be quick here. But the assumptions of rational decision-making and scarcity of resources might seem normal for economists. Both assumptions, however, are highly contested in anthropology. Therefore, it is actually surprising that this economic analysis has had an enormous impact on anthropological thinking about post-socialism, a discipline that usually places much more stress on the interpretation of culture and so forth. And the success has much to do with the work of Catherine Burdery, who introduced Corney's writings to an anthropological audience. Rather than representing his theory as an economic theory, she framed it as emic knowledge. Thus, rather than stressing his intellectual background and career in the US, she located the truth of his theory in his Hungarian citizenship and upbringing. Later ethnographies have taken his analysis of the socialist economy for shortage for granted, so it's just a kind of a given context. And nobody returned actually to read his book, which is a very nice book and easy to read even for a non-economist. Anyhow, when the outcome of the political and economic reforms after the demise of socialism dashed many of the hopes of replicating Western European capitalist states, this undermined the conviction of essential sameness. And as a result, a new phase of othering began. Now the institutions were apparently the same, but the people suddenly appeared to be different. So this was basically then in the early 2000s. Those who had been normal Europeans before, now just as the citizens in so-called developing countries, they would be seen as passive and unduly waiting for state support. In some, they now seem to have different cultural ideas. Sometimes they had now even all of a sudden collective socialist ones that hindered normal economic development. And one remnant of this perspective is the preoccupation of the character of interpersonal relations. And as I described, they are seen as having developed during socialism in response to its endemic shortages and thus being oriented towards access to resources. This element of functionalist interpretation has remained dominant in many post-socialist ethnographies, as in the critiques I mentioned. And I'm coming to the conclusion. So we can sum up by saying that while the two German states existed, parcels sent to the socialist East were politically, economically, and emotionally important. Millions of parcels were sent each year, and the social governments reluctantly learned to rely on the economic value. Despite their material and non-material significance, these kinship practices represent an epistemic void that is, they have never received any kind of social scientific theories. I have argued that we can see the sources for this epistemic void when we follow the critiques uttered towards my analysis of their disappearance. One type of critique is found in the personal accounts of well-educated West Germans who act defensively to Eastern narratives about paternalism and conflict with their own accounts of the close emotional relations with Eastern kin, the appropriate levels of gratitude for the care they received. Such interpretations play an important part in political self-understanding, not only in the construction of Germany as a political unit, but also in that of West Germany as the superior part, both in the past and in the unified present. Kinship across the border was not just an affection between relatives, it was important for naturalizing the construction of the German nation as a political unit. The sibling metaphor of poor brothers and sisters in the East expressed already the tension present in normatively equal relations early on. Ideally, the unity would be expressed in practices of kin care across the German border. When this did not evolve naturally, repeated state campaigns invoked East Germans' needs and longing for support. The moral emphasis on suffering Easterners also allowed Westerners to position themselves on the right side in international politics and reified Western supremacy. This humanitarian framing was unwelcome on the other side, although its restrictive policies nevertheless contributed to the political importance of kinship as well. The political representations had ambivalent repercussions in daily practice. Sending and receiving parcels, letters, and visitors, here I'm talking mainly about the parcels, involved extended kin within each state and across the border. Political pressure and economic hierarchies supported these investments in extended kinship and simultaneously heightened its emotional ambivalence. Packing mundane, quotidian goods and everyday staples in the West to send relatives reinforced the idea of Eastern families were seen as in need and if not actually suffering, at least deprived. On the other side, this construction of kin care induced feelings of humiliation. On both sides, exchange involved embarrassment, and when the wall came down, many of the relatives broke off ties across what was the former border then. Some of these aspects also show up outside popular discourse, specifically in the social scientific type of critique that places West Germany as the more modern element of the Cold War binary. The second type does not start from the assumption of equality and mutuality and emotional closeness, but instead stresses difference and argues in a functionalist manner. Economic deficiencies of the social state are interpreted as having led to an essentially different form of kinship in the East. This argument basically maps the political binary onto kinship, with the socialist form based less on emotions and more on mutualistic interest. Both variants can be linked to ideas about modernization, though in different ways. And both elements are essential to understand the politics of making kinship across the former German border, as well as its topics neglect in social theory. Classical 20th century modernization theories, broadly speaking, posit a separation of politics and kinship. Parallel to this, they testify to a decreasing importance of extended kin and the simultaneous emotionalization of close relations. These interpretations have reached a state of natureness and dominance that goes almost unquestioned and has therefore left these relations in an epistemic void. The reasons for the analytical blindness, I argue, lies in each country's respective self-understanding as modern, so that kinship ties beyond the conjugal families could not be seen even by scientists. Its neglect testifies to the epistemological void created by the focus on the nuclear family, an epistemic consequence of the idea that kinship is not something that exists for individuals in modern states. At the same time, both assumptions are also challenged by kinship practices in the two German states and later the unified Germany. The development of extended kin across the German border, as well as within each country, defies the idea about a decreased role of kinship in modern states. Similarly, the importance of kinship for the formation of states questions its apolitical nature. Paying attention to the practices of extended kinship in Germany does not just provide an interesting exception to classical ideas of modernization. Moving it to the center of attention instead of relegating it to a distant nebulous past or reducing it to a functional response to economic conditions can offer general insights into the phenomenon of political and everyday production of kinship within so-called modern societies. From the German example, we can see how entangled kinship is in state formation and even international politics. The politics of making kinship reflects back state ideas of belonging and ideas of otherness. And as such, these are crucial elements and products of all so-called modern societies. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting work. And I mean, I have a lot of, a lot of emotional reactions right now. We have to be honest, because I spent a lot of time in the 70s and 80s taking packages back and forth across Checkpoint Charlie families. And I think your basic point about the importance of kinship in this period is really important. And you know, it's understudied and how families dealt with each other east and west. Also very much an understudied aspect of what goes on. If I understand correctly, what you're trying to do is you're trying to understand a little bit why scholars are not paying any attention to this, the international scholarly community. And one of the things that I missed a little bit, but again, this relates a lot to work, you know, before the fall of the wall that I did on the scholarship about the GDR as politics. In other words, the politics of the academic, and how the politics of the academic community, especially in Germany, especially in West Germany, obviously politics in East Germany is something, you know, much more structured and there's much more limitations. But you know, there were choices that scholars could make in terms of how they analyze these sorts of questions. And there are still choices that people the way I looked at it, actually, again, this is before the wall, even after the wall. Two is that there was, and maybe still is, a kind of consensus, an almost strangling consensus in the West German academic community around, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with SPD or SPD politics, but kind of left SPD politics about East Germany, which means a kind of acceptance, the kind of notion that that's, socialism will work in the East, just like capitalism will work in the West because they're Germans. A kind of wanting to make up with the East Germans, not to be critical in any sorts of ways. This kind of Brandt, but one step further, kind of Ostpolitik when it had to do with East Germany. And it was politics. And so that it was very hard for people outside of that political consensus then to talk about Germans belonging together, for example, or this question of kinship is perfect example of what people wouldn't want to talk about because we don't really belong together. There's a separate East German, and by the end, as I'm sure you're aware, there was a separate East German state and a separate West German state, which everybody wanted to accept before then, of course, the fall. So that, what do you think about that? That politics, in other words, not just the politics of the people involved in the relationships, but the politics of scholarship played a big role in this.
Yeah.
And still does.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I think part of it is what I'm trying to say, that this is that politics are, it's not only the politics of people, but it's the politics are involved, let's say, on every layer of these relations. The question for me is, how can that be ignored by the individuals who are living these relations in their own accounts? How can they phrase it as, it's just my individual biography? And how can scholars ignore that? And I do think it is, but beyond the kind of very concrete entanglements of in, let's say, German politics, it's also the perception of oneself as being a modern state. That is something that I want to say. Okay, we have all this, but it's an exception, and therefore we don't mention it because it actually doesn't really exist. So, but what is it then when it doesn't exist? For a family sociologist, when a family sociologist can constantly talk about the dominant unit being a conjugal family. And it's about, and I think this is also why it has importance outside this particular political situation, because if we look at other situations, it's always the others who have kinship. And this is normative. So I think it has political, very practical repercussions also, it can be in dealing with migration, it can be in dealing with minorities, it can be just political discourse, when it's always about the others have something that is wrong, and that is usually extended kinship. Other things are being also wrong. But so I think this is why this kind of, in a way, exceptional situation can bring us insight that go beyond the concrete political circumstances. And as you mentioned in the beginning, yes, there were a lot of emotions involved, but this was also not independent from the political situation, and it was supported by in specific times, or try to restrict, which basically has the same effect. I mean, the GDR politics, I'm talking, the whole restriction also politicizes everything that is going on, of course.
You find the void to be surprising. In my personal experience, those people receiving aid or charity sometimes are not eager to continue to talk about it, and those giving charity are sometimes very eager to get credit or to have those receiving express gratitude, and that can become a little tiresome after a while. And so, you know, is this a reflection of basic human nature, especially when East German citizens were now, following unification, supposed to be equals, not second-class citizens receiving charity? And my second question is, following reunification, there was a huge state aid plan from West to East Germany, as you know, many hundreds of billions of dollars. In essence, did that cause the Parcels aid to be become more insignificant in terms of its historical impact?
Thank you. First question, is it a surprise really if you receive charity that you have this unequal relation? No, that is not surprising. But it is surprising here because it is not admitted that it is charity. So that is basically what I'm trying to say. It is so the West German side trying to, being still very paternalistic, but trying to stress equality. We also received something. They were happy, or we put so much effort, which kind of tries also, you know, we put all the efforts in there. So they try to equalize it. Otherwise, you know, one could say you could admit it, and then it's a charity relation. So did the state financial transfer make the parcels superfluous? Yes, I guess one could argue that. At least the staples were not, you know, needed anymore. But one could also say that the inequality, despite of all the state transfer, remained, and at least in last part. So why would the state not try to rely again on personal relations? It could, you know, you could have still, you know, ask, you know, support your relatives in the new states or something. You could have done. It's not, there's nothing natural that would be against it. And instead, there is this unified solidarity tax, which was throughout the years then became ever harder to gain political support for that. And as I said, and then the discourse has changed into othering. So there is an undue claim of suffering, or these also talks about conspicuous consumption on this other side. So why do I have an as expensive car as I do? So things like that. So yeah, I think so maybe it's not a surprise, but it's still it is nothing natural in any kind of policy, and so there is nothing natural in not trying to support unification by strengthening belonging. And as I said, the opposite happens, and also citizenship, you know, very strongly used sanguinis first becomes changed because it's not that important anymore. And also, very frankly, do we want to have all these Germans in former Soviet Union and Romania and all of that? No, restrictions up on distance, and now something else becomes more important. And you can at least acquire German citizenship by demonstrating you are a good German in other ways now.
I have two questions. One is related to epistemic void. Usually, if you have epistemic void in academic research, you might turn into alternative sources of knowledge, like literature, art, movies, museums, exhibits that might deal with the problem, which is the subject of your research, in a very interesting way. So my question is, would you consider to look for answers in this other fields than academic writings. And the second question has to do with the literature on post-socialism. And I wonder, do you see differences between the literature built in Western part of the world, or Western academic writing, and East Central European academic writing regarding the post-socialist condition and the subject of your research? Because, you know, I feel that the literature, the problem of literature that you presented is very typical for Western humanities and social science, not Eastern Central European. They have different research questions.
Yeah, thank you. Two great questions. So one, I'm really not very good in popular culture, but there were a few films, I think that at least in a satirical way. And also there is one, how should I put him? It's not really a comedian, but there is this one person who does funny things, who asked, where are all the best parcels gone? So, and he did this in the beginning of the 2000s. So there are some reactions to that. Is the literature on post-socialism different? I would say yes and no. I mean, this also would go back to the first question, not maybe for the hierarchies or specific choices within the German academia, but within the international academia and the workings on post-socialism. So there were obviously, and I'm mostly acquaintance with, of course, the anthropological literature, and due to all the restrictions and the closeness during the times of socialism, there were only very few Western scholars who did like the typical thing, go into another country and spend there a whole year and then, you know, come back. So there were this, they had, they were mostly in rural areas. They had also sometimes the state as a topic and so forth. So when the wall fell, then they became like big figures. And a new generation would be trained of Eastern European intellectuals who went often to one of the Western universities, and they came back and they basically, so here I would say for this generation, I don't see much of a difference, because if they were trained, and the account of Catherine Verdery was so dominant, and she also was a very dominant figure, that I wouldn't find any difference. So for taking this the socialist economies of shortage as, you know, general, so it's just given, so we don't talk about this, and now in the very anthropological presentism we talk about what is now. There are of course some others, but there are some folklorist studies who had other topics, but I don't see a kind of a general, but you might know better and you can correct me. As for the family sociology, I would also say that it's this kind of general account is all over the place in the social sciences, like everywhere. Diminished importance of kinship, especially of extended kinship, and diminished political importance, you know, apart from national studies where it's always, you know, family is the smallest unit, or the polity modeled upon the family unit. So we have these things, and the nation as extended family. There is a little bit of that, but it's not being seen as an important practice or otherwise important than for national ideologies.
Insert my privilege. And I was wondering if you could talk about more on how the state managed and used kinship instrumentally to obtain its policy goals, right? Your classic political science question. But, you know, this wasn't a spontaneous effort on behalf of West German families towards their East German families. It was managed by the state, it was encouraged by the state. there are tax write-offs, there's packages, the posters encouraging people to write more and send more. So how do you, what's your account of the state's role here in managing and using instrumentally kinship?
Yeah, I think it's very big. And for one, it managed. So if we are in the, directly after the war, the borders were still permeable. There was a lot of exchange here and there. And then it was very important for the West German parts to say that every talk about unity is communist propaganda. So now, when then the wall was built and it became ever stricter, so this kind of switch to making unity my own goal, and the others are responsible for what was then called partition. I mean, the question is always, what partition? What is the whole here? Germany in the borders of, I don't know, 19 whatever, 2017 or 2039. So what is the whole anyhow? So what is the whole? So now, switching to unity, I think that that kinship was very instrumental in getting this shift done. And it was also very instrumental to put oneself on the international agenda, being on the right side in international negotiations later on. And even after the detente time, it still remained, it's still, because it was framed as apolitical, it's just the emotions of people belonging together that find the expression there. So it was, I think it came handy, to put it this way. And it was also, money was put into this, all this tax reduction that, by the way, also came up in my Eastern interlocutors' accounts. So they say, it's all the state. They stay supported them. So they in with hindsight, with the wisdom of hindsight, they questioned the emotional quality. But that was not your question. Yeah, I think the state was very present, and this is part of my argument, that the state is so present, invested so much into kinship, which is partly that it's so important also for the self-understanding, that what I'm calling the kind of mutual constituency of the state and kinship here. So it's a decisively modern phenomenon, and nothing can be modern or apolitical. Whatever form, whatever shapes it takes.
If I might, isn't a piece of this too the visits back and forth officially fostered both by the Western government, but also the East? Those visits back and forth, for marriages, for burials, for births, you could apply. And I mean, people did get together. It wasn't as if they
No.
families.
No, they were not completely cut off, and there were so, but the stress was on the, which was also true. The GDR government wants to restrict the contact, and thereby family and kinship became a topic in the what is the English word for them? The Vier-Mächte-Abkommen. So when the international former occupational powers were sitting together with the Germans and were negotiating for widening of the rights to visits. And so in the beginning, it was very restricted. Then it was only pensioners who could go from the east to the west. Then you could apply, and what one can see also in the applications, and that is something I mentioned in the longer version, that people would apply, although it was very restrictive. So what is a close relative? Close relative is only the children and not a final relatives, but the applications get ever more widened to what we would call extended kin. So second degree cousins, final relatives, sisters-in-law, applying to go to this, what is then called an important family event, for example, or burial. So it's constantly a topic of bilateral but also international negotiations, which is part of the argument. It is very important in international politics as well. and again, never acknowledged as such an important topic for these negotiations.
I want to ask about this in Germany, because in Czechia, the Revolution 89 is somehow in some sociological essays seen as a colonization of the socialist state by the family. But it is the family, the power of the families, who actually made the Czech revolution so easygoing. So I was just wondering if there is some connection between this politics of support of the families across the border and the discourse about the family.
I think I didn't really get the question. So the question is if in 89 in Germany, the revolutionary events would have been smoothened by the existence of families.
This is this is the question of how it was, but more how it is seen, how it is politics of the family support had some continuation in these events, or it was what was apprehended of that?
I was never. Nobody would ever talk to me. So when I talk to those who have been very active in these events, you know, like going to the secret police headquarters and trying to destroy the papers or whatever, or who have also became public figures sometimes. There was never mention of Western families in these accounts. These were kind of purely my own political biography. They were also kind of retold in specific in specific circles. So where you know was always, and I think part of that always retelling the same events was more of strengthening that. Because many of them they finally reached their political goals, right? They had become public figures. Some have became prizes, and so found themselves 15 years later in, you know, not that good either economically situations or not anymore politically important. And I think this kind of coming together and retelling these revolutionary stories had more of securing the ontological security among themselves. And in these accounts, Western Germans were either absent or they would also now reevaluate. But there was another aspect of your question. In the events as such, or if that was politically, I think what then happened that they, what in some of the accounts that they would say not during the revolutionary events, but then they tried to visit either relatives they have never seen before because they couldn't go, or they had long relations with, and then were all like disappointment stories. So I visited my aunt and she was just this arrogant West German, as you can imagine, or then we have also inheritance conflicts now because property suddenly became more valuable again. So then the Westerns were seen as coming already with their lawyers, and the Easterners presented themselves as, you know, not knowing what to do. Inheritance laws also changed overnight, of course. So yeah, so stories like this. So kinship actually didn't, at least not in this narratives, was not present as something facilitating. And this is, of course, all Muffinside, right? I mean, this was already in the 2000s, so it's Muffinside. I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm just saying how, with this wisdoms or in this situation, 10 or 15 or 20 years later, specific events become symbols of or are interpreted in a specific way. It doesn't mean that before they wouldn't long for the products or wouldn't have loved their relatives or whatever.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for a fantastic talk.